or at least between the contexts, right, then that's a very different architecture than what you're talking about for driving BI types of applications.
I'll just make one point since you hit it. I wasn't going to say anything, but then he brought up a fantastic point. It kind of hits on what I was talking about before, that Spark's designed, you're maybe under this theoretical assumption that you have one user consuming the cluster and that's it, and there's not as much notion of how Spark contexts operate. You're in kind of separate executors and separate JVMs, and that's kind of it. I don't have a ton of experience with this, but I'll just give a shout out to Tachyon. This in-memory database layer kind of on top of Spark, I think addresses exactly that problem. If you have, in my case, maybe it's 10 terabytes of credit card transactions or whatever your data set is, that I know, there's still this heavy cost to reading that into memory in the first place, even if you have the terabytes of RAM to support it. But if I'm doing Spark work and there's 10 other analysts also doing Spark work and they're all trying to read that in, that's obviously going to be a problem. And storing that in RDD and caching it is not feasible across multiple Spark contexts. I think Tachyon's being designed to basically solve that problem, that they can be your original data source. Instead of reading from HDFS, passing an HDFS URI, you pass a Tachyon URI, and it's built to fit pretty seamlessly with HDFS, that it implements all the Hadoop writables and all that kind of stuff. So it really is, like, from what I've seen, and probably my other point, it probably gets a little more complex when you get into the weeds, but it looks like it's practically a one-liner that you're loading data into this kind of persisted in-memory data store outside of Spark itself, and then you just like a one-liner to point to it. It seems like it solves a lot of problems, but I have not deployed or anything into production, so I can't really say what the gotchas are.
Yes, I'll make a quick comment. I guess from a Zoom data perspective, looking at the enterprise, we don't think it's all going to converge. There's still mainframe systems out there, right? So the way we look at it, so data has a lot of gravity. It's going to stay where it is. The concept of trying to ETL that into one place, whether it's the enterprise data hub, the data lake, the traditional enterprise data warehouse, it takes time to do that. There's skill set, and I think given the agility and sort of the changing business requirements and kind of the need of the speed to look at it, it's going to kind of inhibit that. And then the vision of kind of, I guess, what Gartner kind of labels as the logical data warehouse. So the way we wanted to kind of look at that is, so HANA having the memory cubes, Oracle memory or index, again, they're all just optimization techniques to read data fast. And then from a visualization perspective, the thing you want to do is the user wants to interact with data, which essentially issues a query against the source of the data. And having those techniques makes it just fast to read it back. So from our perspective, we want to embrace that. We want to have the ability to kind of leverage that if those performance or those technical sort of infrastructures exist. And then where there is not performance, there's lots of different ways to bring that data into faster places, right? And for us, as long as we're connecting to it, and then having the ability for people to fuse data from these different sources, then we can realize the sort of the vision around logical data warehouse.
So we're like we have time for let's say one more question, or?
Yeah. One more question from the audience, and then I think we need to do the individual.
Oh, you want to do?
Yeah.
Already has its own business intelligence solution. I think it's called IoT before. Not sure what's not in Microsoft. It has its own. So are you targeting the customers for using their business intelligence tools, your tools, or is it for the rest of us, as Apple said, like when they introduced the Mac? And how much is the success right now?
I'll let you start with that.
All right, I'll start it. So I guess for us as the newcomers, right, we're not necessarily looking to target specific tools. We're looking at pain points, right, and we're looking at use cases. And then really from a technology perspective, just given the approach we have, we want to enable those use cases that are not necessarily accessible with the current tool set. So that's the way we're looking at it. And for us, that's really kind of going in with that modern architecture, right? So the modern architecture is all about having the server installed, right? So the server could be on the cloud, it could be on premise, it could be contained in a Docker image. I mean, there's so many different ways to kind of package that. And then from a data perspective, right, our architecture says, use the right store, right, that makes sense for that data. And then we'll let you connect to it. And our goal, again, is to kind of bring the business user to the front seat so that they can sit side by side with the developer and the data scientist. So I think to kind of like summarize what I said, for us, it's about the use case.
I would agree, right? It's about the use cases. And the real special thing about big data is that the use cases that really require big data require you to think a little bit differently about the way you visualize data. So Platfora, rather than going down this kind of same roads that a lot of other folks have gone down, we use HTML5 Canvas. We actually brought the guy who wrote Kinetic.js in-house. So we can do big data scale types of visualizations, millions and millions of points rendered on the screen in real time, without having to have a thick client or any of those kinds of things, right? So when you start talking about use cases and traditional BI tools, a traditional BI tool is generally not going to scale to those types of data sources, at least without doing a whole lot of work to make that big data really small before you can really kind of suck it into whatever local processing solution they might have. So there's a lot of value in continuing to use those types of technologies for operational reporting and whatnot. There's not I wouldn't say there's a huge driver to take your 1,000 can crystal reports and move them to a Hadoop ecosystem. I don't think you're going to get a lot of additional business value from migrating those things to a big data ecosystem. But when your questions become more nebulous, it's not, how do I do this one thing? It's, is there anything unusual going on in my data today? Which is a really nebulous, kind of hard to put your finger on type of question. You really need a tool that's going to allow you to visualize millions and millions of points and allow you to really ask those questions in a super iterative type of fashion. And I think what you're going to see is those are the questions going forward that are going to be the high value for businesses, because traditional BI tools have been really good at solving for, hey, how many Diet Coke cans did I sell today, right? The traditional BI tools are really good at answering those types of questions. It's the second, third level types of questions where you're not, your answer isn't quite as focused, where the big data types of exploratory interactive interfaces into those data sources become really valuable.
So I think you got a couple of things there. I mean, so we've talked a lot about new stack and old stack a bit today, and it's not that the old stack goes away. There's a right size in the market of that. So for your external reporting, for example, you still do that in a database with a traditional BI tool, and that's what you use. So that's happening. So I think there's two kind of factors that are driving this. One, you've got the right size of those traditional investments, and not because they're bad tools, mostly because the tools don't deliver in the time frame that they need to for business people. And then you've got all this generated data that's occurring in the Internet of Things and devices and all this other stuff that, to the points that were made, frankly, the old tools were not designed to do. So the traditional tools are more designed when you know the purpose, when you know the question, you create a schema or a structure to support the question. And questions and analytics change and have to ebb and flow. And having to queue up and go talk to someone to say, I need to change my schema now, doesn't work, and that's what's being rejected. So, we're not going to go after trying to do what those tools do. It's being, in fact, we've rejected that wholeheartedly. We've stayed very far away from it. But the combination of these tools, I think, is something else you're going to start to see. So embedded BI in visual, leveraging, when I want to get to the book of business for the lowest level of detail, that's a great BI report application. Go use it for that. So, we don't want to sound like BI doesn't work in cases and isn't needed in businesses. But there's that right size thing is, I think, the bigger point that's there.
Okay, so we had some questions prepared specifically for each of our guests, which I'll just bring in, and then we can go back to maybe one more question And I think altogether we have till 8:45 here, so once we wrap up with public questions, if you want to stick around, talk to our panelists, you're welcome to do so. So I'll start with Azad. So the question is, Zoom data emphasizes real-time analytics and low latency queries, so you kind of described the streaming approach to data. Like, how are you specifically leveraging Spark to enable that? I think you addressed it a little bit, if you could just go into more detail about that.
Sure. Yeah, I gave everybody the history of kind of Zoom data. We started out in sort of like the mobile touch interface, using web-based sort of visualization, JavaScript, and then having streaming. We actually started off of Storm, and then had D3 for the visualization and sort of an iOS wrapper for the interface. And then we had some issues on the scaling with that approach, just because our vision was make it exploratory, let the business user ask the question, let them slice and dice, filter, etc. And when we started doing that, we just saw that Storm couldn't just kind of scale to that type of use case where essentially the same user in a dashboard can literally spawn up a bunch of topologies running. Then from there, we kind of like migrated, started looking at stuff, and started building our own stuff on top of sort of the Storm framework using Java. And then really what we started there is our web interface sort of has a WebSocket connection to the server, which essentially is a tunnel, which is basically a live connection. You can just stream answers back to the visualization, which is great for real-time use cases. But then as we started looking at historical use cases and kind of looking at the Hadoop, Impala, and other sort of interactive SQL tools that came on top of it, we said that approach will work great if we kind of know like the partitioning strategy of the data, assuming it's columnar, and it has that set up. And what we could do now is actually take the user wanting to, let's say, get an answer to a question and break that up to a bunch of little queries, send that against the right places in the partitions of the backend system, and then as the answers are coming back, just stream it directly into the visualization. So that's where kind of our data sharpening microquery strategy came. And then looking at the momentum of Spark streaming and kind of the Spark, so I talk about the architecture, embracing Spark sort of as our cache for connectivity, as well as doing fusion and calculations. I think now we'll want to kind of go back to that real-time use case and start looking at Spark streaming and what that means for us. So exploratory sort of stages right now. We're still using kind of our sort of in-house built streaming technology, but more and more we're starting to add Spark into it. So more to come on that.
Thanks a lot. So for Keith, so the platform says that you're kind of like the only end-to-end general solution on Hadoop, right? So usually if you have a general solution, you kind of have to make trade-offs, that you can't be as specific, like you might not be as powerful in the data wrangling aspect or in other aspects. So how do you see kind of the trade-offs that need to be made, and when does it make sense to use a more specialized tool, right? Maybe because the input data is like very unstructured or very complex?
Well, initially we made the trade-offs on data ingest, right? So we focused on primarily on the middle tier of our product, which is the caching and compute engine, because if that doesn't work, then it doesn't really matter how pretty your visualizations are. And then we focused in 2014 predominantly on additional ways to visualize and experience that data, geospatial, different types of different archetypes and whatnot. With our move to Spark, we're anticipating that Spark's going to open up the ability for effectively adapters that are going to allow us to expand that data ingest capability very, very rapidly and in a very custom fashion as customers need it, but while still keeping the same ease of use that we've had from our kind of a full stack solution. We intentionally went down the full stack route rather than just being a visualization tool or just being an in-memory engine or just doing deep processing, because we felt like the workflow, the keeping everybody in one system and allowing you to go from raw data to actionable insight was the important thing. Because if you get that iteration loop of, oh, I want to ask a new question, I've got to make a change to my data, I can make a change to my data, and now I can go ahead and answer my new question. If you can shorten that loop to be a really short period of time, and in a lot of cases our customers are going through that loop many, many times a day, rather than the previous architectures where in some cases you might be you might not have to make a change to your data mart, so you can ask a question right away. But if you do, all of a sudden you've broken off into IT land. By making the decision to go that full stack route, we knew we were going to have to make some of those trade-offs. So as far as like specific things that Platfora, if I had a customer come to me and say, hey, we want to do, arbitrary graph traversals, right? I would probably recommend that they find another solution. That's not something that we've spent any time focusing on, although, if you talk to our VP of product or the CEO of the company, they'll say, that's something that we think is super important and very serious, but we also know that it's going to be a lot of engineering effort that we really haven't spent any time on yet. So that might be a 2016 thing rather than a 2015 thing. But definitely from a 2015 perspective, we're focused on making this data ingest, our data prep type of capability, robust enough to be able to handle the 99% of the use cases that are out there.
Thanks a lot. So the next question is for Ben. So D3 is known to be, a great tool because of its flexibility, and you can really build custom solutions, but it also has a very steep learning curve. Do you have advice for a company that wants to start with D3 visualizations, and also maybe some of the frameworks that make it easier to use for kind of the novice?
I do. It's probably easier to kind of set the stage for some of this just in terms of how I came to be using D3 in the first place. So I was previous career in the defense industry before I got into banking. Especially there when you're on kind of military-related computers that have closed-down access, you don't have a lot of easy ways to get new packages or software or really anything. And someone came to me and asked, and they basically said, we want this visualization, it needs to be live, it has to have hooks to databases, it needs to be kind of interactive and all this. And they're like, the previous guy tried using PowerPoint and didn't work. And you're going to be on a CIA computer, so you can't really download anything, or if you try to access the wrong thing, you'll probably go to jail. This was kind of my foray into, I guess, JavaScript and D3 and all these things. And you start building, I started building this out. It was really cool, and that as you said, I had this ultimate flexibility to kind of build anything I wanted. And it was kind of ugly because again, don't have a design bone in my body, but it was cool to build it from the ground up. But there is this huge point as you go into it. If you're just doing like raw D3 and you're building all these charts and you want these things all linked up, you really don't want to be on the total end of the spectrum where you're manually building line charts and bar charts, and you're building the axes manually. It gets really tedious to build every tiny little element. And then the other end of the spectrum is, if I want to scale that up, maybe I'd use something that we could purchase, something along those lines. There is a cool middle ground, I think. There's so Square is one of the great companies that just building really cool layers on top of D3. What I used at the time was I used Crossfilter, which was this cool kind of index data transformation thing to quickly, it was kind of an in-memory pivot table to slice your data very quickly. So it was kind of write insert heavy, but then very fast on the read. And then there's another package that sits on top of D3 called DC.js that you can build all these, as one layer up in abstraction, you can build these charts really quickly that look nice. And they're all dynamic, so I build all these different charts and I click on one to filter something, everything else updates very, very quickly, which is really neat, so I didn't have to hand code all these things. And for this particular thing I did, I had line charts moving and they look really ugly and kind of terrible. The data was there, but it would take me more time to actually make it look presentable and production level. So Square built another thing. There's a kind of a live streaming line chart or time series visualizer called Cubism. Cubism.js sits on top of D3 and it plays well with Mongo and things like that. And I just found I think there's a myriad of packages out there that kind of, you need to take some of the abstraction away, but still you want a lot of control. They're pretty simple APIs. They don't really contribute too much, but you're also not in the camp of literally like placing every pixel on the screen, which gets kind of old.
Thanks a lot. And so the last question is for you, Paul. And like one thing, could you just repeat the timing of, I think I know you went into it in the beginning, the timing of the SPAR SQL connector and kind of like basically when it will be available for everyone. And then we also have a question with regard to the robustness of the Hadoop connectors, if there's any differences between the different distributions that are out there, Cloudera, Hortonworks, WebR, Pivotal, IBM.
Great, so in terms of our connector, currently in beta, due out at the end of February, early March. We're tracking well with that. We have hundreds of customers in the program, getting good feedback, so that looks pretty imminent now. In terms of robustness against Hadoop connectors, we're almost equally robust across all of them, and we support SQL 92 on all of them. The functions that we leverage are very similar. There might be some nuance because MapR has some different functionality that they provide, or Cloudera has some. So there's some nuance, but in general they're equally consistent. Probably the biggest separator right now is we do support Kerberos on Impala, and that's probably the biggest single feature across the distributions that might be a game changer for a customer. You know, like Cap One or someone who's got a large deployment of it, you want to have that piece. So we're working hard on the others, but that's probably the biggest single one.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think we can, at this point, wrap up the public questions, but you guys stay around for a couple more minutes, so for any individual questions, I think you definitely deserve a beer now, so after we kept you here for an hour and a half. So just thanks them again. And thank you all for coming, so enjoy the rest of the beer if there's any leftover food, and yeah, thanks again.
Good job.
Yeah, thanks so
Wow,
much.
you guys were like really informative.
Appreciate it. Yeah.
I was
Great.
like, very good job. I was like taking crazy notes.
Yeah, I think I need something to.
Thank you.
How are you?